Good Monday. This is Jay Brew, co-chairman of Seafried and Brew, coming back to discussion on the capital proposal that is out there. And some of you that may have heard my first webcast on this is that I said there is very little to nothing in the new capital proposal that would have prevented the failures of the community banks that occurred post-financial crisis. So this is an overall letdown. And what I'm saying to all of the directors and senior management out there, we need to be writing letters to the regulators saying that this is not right. And when you look at it, and based upon the capital levels that are on average throughout the community banks across the nation, is that essentially hardly any of this will affect them. As I talked about last time, in some of these rules, it might affect maybe 120 banks out there. So you can sit back and say, well, we have plenty of capital, we'll be all right. This isn't going to affect us in any way. But think of it this way, is that as you keep paying the FDIC cost and the big upfront FDIC costs that everybody paid, that was to basically pay off for all of the bank failures that you had nothing to do with. So it's coming right out of your pocket. And my feeling is that as bankers, we need to sit there and say no to this proposal, that we want to see a risk-based capital system that once again goes to what Dodd-Frank is preaching, which is that do you have enough capital to cover your risk? And the vast majority of community banks that have survived in here, the answer to that is yes. But the thing is that as community bankers, we need to put safeguards into our system to prevent the huge number of failures, the increase in FDIC costs, not to mention the horrible reputation risk that has occurred out there. And one could argue it's also affected the overall stock prices of community banks. So what we're including with this in the email this week is a little blurb that I put together talking about why this doesn't work, why this would not have prevented the bank failures. This is something that you can send to your regulators saying, this is why I don't believe this proposal works. Because a lot of this, of course, comes out of Basel. Well, as we look at the world banking system, and we look at the problems that still keep occurring with J.P. Morgan, for instance, now the Barclays fiasco over LIBOR, is that once again Basel is in the midst of all of those type of banks. It has nothing to do with community banking. So to some degree, like we did here back on July 4th, 1776, we need to take a stand as community bankers to say this is what's right, not what the world is preaching to us. Because just from the standpoint of not preventing the failed banks, what does it do? Like so many of the regulations coming out of here that we had nothing to do with, is that it's going to add to your overall costs in here with no benefit whatsoever in terms of how you're going to have to keep track of your mortgages, developing systems that may not be in place right now to be able to calculate the risk-based capital level. Then we look at it from the standpoint is the volatility of earnings. When we look at that volatility, is that if our AFS portfolios are going to be calculated in that Tier 1 leverage, is that number one, you're going to see your Tier 1 leverage ratios jumping all over the place. Not indicating any sort of risk necessarily, but it's going to have volatility that's going to confuse people out there. Two, when you look at it, is that it can cause more volatility to your earnings. Because if that AFS portion is running through and interest rates change in here, portfolios go from a profit to loss, is that you could suddenly see your capital heading downward in here. Once again, what the regulators are focusing on here is looking at one part of the bank and having it completely affect your Tier 1 leverage, which is not right, it doesn't make sense, and it should be fought against in terms of community banks being put under this kind of situation, especially when you look at the percentage of your portfolio that is a percentage of assets and the volatility that can occur in that. So guess what happens is that most likely most community banks will manage to keep that tier 1 leverage at that level, which is going to have maybe an adverse effect on earnings overall. So let's look at it on all of these different levels and sit there and say no to this proposal, that we want our own capital system that is going to protect the traditional conservative community bank in this nation. This is Jay Brew. Have a happy 4th of July.